just to go to my own personal story, Jordan, my mother was married and divorced 7 times. And she was a beautiful woman, literally a dead ringer for Marilyn Monroe. And she had a bunch of boyfriends in between. She was a raging alcoholic. So I never had a father growing up. And I was searching for a father myself. And so I saw my mother's lifestyle that was sometimes affluent, primarily alcoholic. She would drink to excess and pass out in a stupor every night. And suddenly I became the parent in the relationship. Even though I was a little boy, I did make sure my mom didn't die, right? So get her in bed, make sure she eats something, and care for her. But so I can understand young people searching, young men searching. I was searching too, but I didn't know what I was searching for. Mm-hmm. I just knew out there was something better than the life I was living. And so it's almost like my mother engaged in a form of pre-evangelism. She sort of in her way showed me the adult world had nothing that I really wanted. And so the answer must be somewhere else. But unfortunately, the whole drug culture was happening, and I bought into the lie of turn on, tune in, drop out, along with a lot of other young people. And I quickly...
Timothy Leary.
Yeah, Timothy Leary, exactly. And I quickly found that wasn't true. And I tried I smoked a lot of weed. I did those things every day and I saved that for weekends. And I had a couple bad trips, and I thought, this is not the direction I want my life to go. And, and I lived for a time with my grandparents, and they had a portrait of Jesus on their wall. And I would often look at it as a young boy and think, I wish I could have known Jesus. It's too bad he was merely a historical figure. And somehow I made a connection on my high school campus when there were these kids that were very outspoken for their faith, that were talking about Jesus. We called them Jesus freaks, not meant as a compliment. And I thought they were all crazy.
How old are you?
Now?
Yeah.
I'm 72.
So you were born in
1952.
52, right.
Yeah.
So you were 18 in 1970.
Yes.
Right. Okay. I'm just trying to place you with regard to the hippie movement. So
right.
You were 16 and
17 in 1970.
Yeah.
And that was the year that I saw these Christians on my high school campus that would sit around at lunchtime and sing songs about God. And I just looked at them and thought, they're all crazy. And then I tried a thought on for size. What if it's true? And I quickly dismissed it as impossible. It couldn't be true because I'd become very cynical because of my upbringing. I've been so disillusioned by the adult world. But then I tried that thought on again. What if it's true? And there was a guy speaking that it's in the movie, the Jesus Revolution movie that it's shown in the film. Jonathan Rumi, who plays Jesus in The Chosen, plays the role of Lonnie Frisbee, this evangelist who had long hair and a beard, who was speaking that day. And he made one statement that got my attention. He said, Jesus said, you're for me or against me. So I looked at all these Jesus freaks and I thought, well, I'm not one of them. Does that mean I'm against Jesus? I thought, well, I don't want to be against Jesus. I believe he's out there. I've seen all of his movies. What I know of him, I have a respect. But then I realized, but I'm not a believer in this sense. Could this happen for me? And I ended up praying. And that was the day that my life changed.
Okay. So now you're watching these kids, the Jesus freaks, and you're having ambivalence about that.
Yeah.
Okay. What's the basis of the ambivalence? What is it about what they're doing? Because this kind of strikes to the heart of the atheistic conundrum too. There can be something, the enemies of Christ in the Gospels, the primary enemies are the Pharisees, right? Yeah. They're religious pretenders.
Yes.
Right. So that's a very interesting thing.
Right.
So you're watching the Jesus freaks, and you said that wasn't a laudatory term, and you're wrestling with their attractiveness. On the one hand, you think there's something to it. On the other hand, you find, what is it that you weren't happy about that you were seeing? Do you think? What was it that was pushing you away?
Well, I think it's just that they seem fanatical. They seem extreme, and it seemed too obvious. Like, are you kidding me? Are you telling me that after my search into all these things, thinking maybe it's in astrology, maybe it's in Eastern religion, maybe it's in drugs, maybe it's in this or it's in that it's literally Jesus Christ, that portrait hanging on my grandmother's wall. Like, I never even considered that is what I was looking for, or I should rephrase it, that's who I was looking for. But and there it was in plain sight. And so it was, I thought it can't be this simple.
So
and
that seemed too absurd in a way.
Well, yes, but then there was something, some of these kids, I knew them, I grew up with them, I partied with them, and I saw they were changed. So I couldn't dismiss them as all being crazy people because I knew them before and I saw transformation had happened in their life. But so I prayed a prayer and I said, God, if you're real, you need to make yourself real to me because I'm full of cynicism, I'm full of doubt.
How old were you at this time?
I was 17.
Okay.
Yeah, but I felt like I was older because I had to grow up faster. And so I think my life experiences were not the typical 17-year-old, but
Well, especially for that time, because at that time, where'd you grow up?
I grew up in California, Newport Beach,
Okay, so
Orange
things
County.
would have been a little more fragmented there than in many places, but most people at that time would have come from intact families. Did you have any male figures in your life that helped you orient yourself along that axis?
No,
Okay,
not really. Not until later. Well, there was one person, Greg Laurie. So my mom almost looks like she kept marrying the same guy. They were kind of, you might call them barflies. You know, they're the guys that have just a few too many of their buttons on their shirt undone. And they're hanging out in the bar. And so she kept marrying like the same guy in sense. And then she met this guy from New Jersey. He was an attorney. He was intelligent. He was educated. He was very conservative, and I don't know what my mother saw in him. He was so different, but he literally took an interest in me. He adopted me. He gave me his last name and treated me as a father should treat a son. So one day
you had a taste of that.
Yeah, so he was that one bright spot, and then there's a neat connecting story where I was able to reconnect later with him and in a sense return the favor a little bit. But so when I came out of school one day in New Jersey, where we were living at the time, the car was packed up with all of our luggage. And I said, where are we going? My mom said, we're going to Hawaii. I said, well, where's Dad? She said, he's not coming. And I didn't see him for the rest of my childhood. So we flew to Honolulu. She had already met another guy who was the most abusive of all of her husbands. In fact, this guy knocked her unconscious with a wooden statue when they were having a drunken fight. And I climbed out of the window of my bedroom and ran to the neighbors. And we moved back to California. But, you know, so I remembered him. And he was someone that was stable. He disciplined me. He gave me an allowance. One time I stole something from a store and he took me down to the jail and introduced me to the prisoners, trying to keep me away from a life of crime. Problem was, I thought it was kind of cool. I kind of missed the memo, but he was a father figure. So even though because I was not planned, you know, my mom had a one-night stand in Long Beach and I was conceived, and I found that out like 30 years later. But because he treated me as a father should treat a son, I've always thought of him and spoken of him as my dad. So here's the cool thing. Even if you're broken, if you're raised in a broken home and you don't have a biological father, I think a man can step in and be a father figure.
Yes.
It could be a pastor. It could be a coach. It could be an uncle. It could be a friend. But a man can step in and show a young man or a young one, because young women obviously need dads too. He can step in and be that father figure for them. And Oscar did that. And then later, after I became a Christian, there was a pastor named Chuck Smith who was kind of that father figure for a lot of us. So it kind of helped me and a lot of other young men find our way. And I think that needs to, and like I was saying to you earlier, I watched a film about you and in the rise of Jordan Peterson. And I saw these young men coming up to you. And it was so interesting to me because they're very young and they're reading what you've written, and they've found you on YouTube. One young man said, I was extremely depressed and even suicidal, and you helped me. And I just thought you're doing that in your way, being a father figure to a generation that is seeking. And I think that's fantastic.
Yeah, well, there's a longing.
Yeah.
There's an innate longing
Yeah.
for the realization of certain patterns,
Yes.
right? And the longing
Established
is
by God.
vague. Yeah. It's deeply instantiated.
Yeah.
And the longing is vague, and there's various ways that it could be catalyzed.
Yeah.
But my sense as a developmental psychologist is that a neurologically intact child needs one good example, right? Zero is too few.
Yeah.
That's fatal, so to speak. But if you're neurologically intact, one example will do the trick.
Yeah.
And so you had the gentleman that you described, and it's also for people who are more aesthetically oriented or intellectually oriented, they can often derive some of that from books and from abstracted representations. You
Yeah.
can pull it in that way too, but you definitely need it.
To come from a home where my mom was married and divorced 7 times with a bunch of boyfriends in between, with a life that was on the wrong trajectory, going the wrong way, and then to have everything changed, that can't be explained to me. Just
Okay, now you said, so 2 things I want to delve
Yeah.
into. So I was curious, you were watching the Jesus
I've
Freaks.
never been to see a psychologist or a psychiatrist, but I feel this is my first time, and you're helping